Tynan Portillo presents a series all about Edgar Allan Poe, the 19th century, and all manners of horror. Today's episode, Unscripted, Edgar Allan Poe's biggest controversies. Hello and welcome back to the Poe Show. I'm your host, Tynan Portillo. And before we get into today's topic, of course, I've got to explain what I'm doing right now, what this is. So Unscripted is going to be a series on the Poe Show podcast. And it's coming because of a few different reasons. Number one, I want to make more content. Number two, I want to have episodes that have a little bit less structure and are more just me talking into my microphone so that it's more of a podcast feel. I do that a little bit already with the after talk for every audio horror story, but I still write scripts for that, breaking down the stories, talking about all of the information and research that has gone into that episode. So this is going to be more raw. I'm going to have a lot less editing, and I'll probably make mistakes here and there. But that's another thing that's going into this. And I just know that people want to know more about Edgar Allan Poe, certain stories, facts about the 19th century, and I want to be able to bring that to you. So if this series does well, I will be doing at least one, possibly two, every month. It's going to be a lot easier for me to manage rather than a whole audio story where I'm narrating the story. I have to get every word right. I have to edit all of that together, find or make sound effects, compose original music. If you're a regular listener, you already know what goes into every episode. But yeah, so today's topic. Today we are talking about Edgar Allan Poe's biggest controversies. Now, I believe that, in my research over studying Edgar Allan Poe, that the biggest controversies in his life were, number one, his marriage to Virginia Eliza Clem. And most of you will understand why, but I'll get into that. I'll also be talking about his rumored affair and his feud with Rufus Griswold. I also feel like it's a big controversy, especially in the literary and scholarly world, about Poe's racist depictions in his stories. And I feel like that's really important to cover because it is such a hot topic. Not the story, obviously, but it is such a hot debate topic in the scholarly world about Edgar Allan Poe's work. Now, I want to clarify something before we begin. I do not expect Edgar Allan Poe to have modern views of today in the 19th century. But a lot of what I'm going to discuss in this episode is still objectively wrong. So during this episode, I am not going to justify Poe's views, actions, or beliefs just because I admire his writing, nor am I going to ignore the fact that they are wrong. I will say this time and again because to me, this is not a this or that issue. I think we can all be mature enough to balance the truth that Edgar Allan Poe did, believed, and wrote things that are wrong, and at the same time made some damn good literature. Human beings are complex creatures, and we need to understand them in the scope of history without justifying all of their actions. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a famous feminist from the 19th century into the 20th who pioneered the fights for women's health in medicine and women's suffrage, even the ability for women to establish financial independence from men. But she was also a white supremacist and eugenicist. So it's disappointing to learn these truths about people that we want to admire, but we have to prevent ourselves from putting them onto pedestals. They are not gods, and we do not worship them. Of course, that might seem like a contradiction when my whole podcast is about Edgar Allan Poe, but the literature has grown beyond the man. So, on to Poe's marriage. Now, for those of you who don't know, Edgar Allan Poe, when he was 27 years old, decided to marry his cousin, Virginia Eliza Clem, when she was 13 years old, which makes him more than double her age. And that happened on May 16th, 1838. And yes, they did lie on the marriage license. Typically and traditionally, Edgar would have had to receive permission to marry Virginia from her father. However, her father had recently died, I believe it was a couple years ago. And she and her mother, Maria Poe, were surviving based off of Virginia's grandmother's pension from the government, renting out rooms and doing odd sewing favors for neighbors. So the women were completely on their own, and sadly, during the 19th century, women did not have the rights that they have today, so they could not make an income, and they were on the edge of destitution. Keeping that in mind, Edgar offering to marry Virginia was one way to help everyone in the household and to put Virginia in a safer environment. Now, a cousin of the Poes, his name is Nielsen Poe, he offered to Maria Poe, Virginia's mother, he offered to take care of Virginia, seeing that she was a child, and said, I will have her in my home, me and my wife will look after her, I will take care of her education, I will pay for all of her needs until she reaches 18 and eventually gets married. Now, for one reason or another, Maria Poe did not agree to this. And during this time, Edgar Allan Poe was actually over in New York, and he was planning on proposing marriage to another woman. And right after he had proposed this, because he had just talked to her father and said, if I remain sober for a certain amount of time, will you allow me to marry your daughter? And her father said yes. So Edgar Allan Poe is on this journey to remain sober and writes to Maria Poe about this. Around that same time, Nielsen Poe is offering to take care of Virginia. And then we get a letter from Maria to Edgar, where she is expressing this dire circumstance, where if Virginia goes to be with Nielsen Poe, who lives a few states over, then Edgar may never see Virginia again. Now, for most biographers and Poe historians, they say that the relationship that Edgar had with Virginia was one of pure love and more likely brother and sisterly love. They were great friends and they teased each other and they played games together, and they were always very colloquial in their interactions. But Maria wanted Virginia to marry Edgar. She loved Edgar and felt that he was essentially her own son. And Edgar, after hearing the news that Virginia may be torn away from him, writes the famous letter where he says, tears are blotting my eyes. I cannot see the page on which I write these words because of the tears. He says something along those lines. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but to an outsider, it really looks like a man throwing a temper tantrum, but it comes from the narrative that Maria Poe had spun in that letter to Edgar to make him feel like he was losing his beloved cousin, whom he called his little sissy, again, treating her with sisterly love. And Virginia's father, being dead, could not give his consent to their union, which is why they lied on the marriage license, saying Virginia was 21, so that she wouldn't need the consent of her father. And that was not typical. In fact, just by a fact of lying on the marriage license, you can tell that's not typical. Now, keep in mind, most states for the age of consent in America, most states by 1880, and this is quite shocking to me, had an age of consent of 10. Now, that is extremely shocking. It disturbs me quite a bit. And of course, it varies state by state. But the reason that a lot of people say, well, a marriage like that, it was typical. It was fine back then. The reason that a lot of people brush that under the rug is because, well, we have really been told that, and they don't understand the circumstances of young marriage, so or child marriage. So a lot of the time, child marriage in different cultures would have been arranged by families, but America, having come from the British colonies and Britain and everything, now established its own independence, but still took a lot of its culture from Britain. And in Britain, it was very typical for families, royal families, to have their children marry each other as children, or older and younger, but, higher status families would do that all the time. And that was more common. That was considered more common, let's say, between a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old to be betrothed and wedded. And typically, at least in America, that included the consent of the parents, which again, Virginia's father could not give because he was busy being dead. So this was an oddball marriage that would have been criticized greatly even during Poe's time in the 1830s, leading into the 1840s. It was not typical. It was not something that people just did back then. I feel like there's a lot of narratives that go around saying, oh, well, this is typical for that time, and a lot of people don't actually look at the numbers. For instance, I've heard some people say, well, you probably would have been dead at 30 during the 19th century. However, first of all, it depends on the years that you're looking at. In the early 1850s to the late, let's say early 1800s to the mid 1800s, and then 1850 and beyond, life expectancy and birth rate start to go up very drastically. So in everything before 1850, yeah, you get a lot of people who the average lifespan was about 38 years to 40 years, and the birth rate was terrible. So if you made it to 1 year old, then you'd most likely make it to 10 years old. But if you made it to 10 years old and you made it to 11 and you made it to 12, your likelihood of getting older kept on going down. So all of that to say that this marriage was not done for any of those reasons. One of the main reasons was to help save the Poe women from destitution. And even though there was another avenue, right, with Nielsen Poe, and it was a way for Edgar and Virginia to continue to stay close to each other. Now, along with that, you have friends of the Poes, family friends, who say that the way that the Poes, meaning Edgar and Virginia, interacted with each other was always wholesome. It was always loving. They were the best of friends. There was an account of them actually playing hop frog in a park, and they were having so much fun and going so fast, leaping over one another, that Edgar leaped over Virginia and split his pants in two in the behind. So that's an interesting image to have in your head of, the sullen and depressed Edgar Allan Poe having fun playing a game with his wife/cousin and splitting his pants. A really hilarious image, but that is how they interacted with each other out in the public. And private lives, for that matter, especially in the 19th century, were a very private matter. So some of you may be asking yourself, was the marriage ever consummated? And the evidence is inconclusive. Most people would say, just knowing that, they got married, they're husband and wife, they can assume, yeah, they probably consummated the marriage right away. Years down the line, we don't know. In fact, there are family friends who account and say that the Poes never slept in the same bed until Virginia was 16. So, and some Poe biographers also argue that as well. So that is a matter for debate, and in my opinion, I don't think we'll ever know the real honest answer. But we can say that Virginia, through their whole marriage, always expressed the greatest joy at being with Edgar, and that they were loving towards one another. Again, that does not justify it, just gives it context. Next, we have, and this is kind of weird to talk about, seemingly such a hot topic, but also something so that incurred such loyalty in Edgar Allan Poe, not having Virginia leave him. But then where we have to cover his rumored affair. Now, this affair comes from his poem, A Valentine. And it started out as a rumor, but it has some strength behind it. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a poem called A Valentine. And in that poem, you can read it. It says that there is a secret code that gives away the name of the person that this Valentine is to. And it basically says, you'll never be able to figure it out. Well, I forget what this term is called, and I should have looked it up, but there's a term where the first letter of the first line of a poem and the second letter of the second line and the third letter of the third line and so on spell out the whole name of Francis Sargent Osgood. So that is who the Valentine was to. And Francis Sargent Osgood was a fellow writer and fellow poet, and he had reviewed some of her poetry before, and they had talked before. They were actually fairly good friends, and he had always expressed some kind of interest in her stories and poetry. So this poem, A Valentine, is the first time that we get one of these writers subtly hinting at something more than professional courtesy. And it spread like wildfire. It was the talk of the town, and that's why a lot of this is probably just rumors, but it led to a whole lot more. So while the wildfire is spreading about this flirtation between these two prominent writers for their time, you get a third person stepping in, Elizabeth Elliot. And Elizabeth Elliot herself was an author, and she wrote a ton of books, and she pioneered some feminist works as well. And what had happened was Elizabeth Elliot, who was actually quite fond of Poe, grew quite jealous and decided to stoke the fire, so to speak. So she goes, out of all people, to Virginia. And she says, Virginia, it appears that your husband is flirting with somebody else. Now, keep in mind, at this time, Virginia had also recently contracted tuberculosis, and she was ill quite a lot of the time, which honestly was just, I think Elizabeth Elliot did it on purpose to create tension in the Poe home. But understanding that that's what's going on, Virginia lamented to Poe and wrote letters to, I believe there's a letter to her mother and a letter to a family friend, where she expresses the idea of actually Elizabeth Elliot and Francis Sargent Osgood being the death of her, despite her being ill. And Elizabeth Elliot spread a couple more fires and decided to keep up the drama because she didn't like this affair, rumored affair, going on between Francis and Edgar. So this is where it starts to get really juicy. Elizabeth Elliot is creating that tension in the Poe household, and then she is shown these letters by Virginia to kind of prove like, do you think this is flirtation? How do you think about this? Because many women wrote to Edgar during his career. Many women who were fellow poets wanted his literary advice. Many others were fans, and some people were more than fans. And there were a few letters from Francis Sargent Osgood. Elizabeth Elliot saw these letters and said, well, I'll write to Frances and tell her to demand those letters back, lest it add to the scandal. So that's exactly what she did. Elliot wrote to Frances and said, you should definitely get those letters back. And Elizabeth Elliot did the same thing. And then Poe, in reaction to this, said, no, I'm not going to give back those letters. In fact, he said to Elliot, why don't you keep track of your own letters? And presumably had shown a letter to some of her friends who had been there to pick up her letters. he had shown to Ellet's friends a letter that had presumably a phrase on it that was something like, "I want you to call for the evening," which was, for the time, an implied seduction. So, not only does that anger Ellet, but she talks to her brother, who's a colonel in the military. And then her brother goes to Poe and threatens him, writes to Poe actually, and he doesn't go to him physically. He writes to Poe and says, "You'd better burn those letters and apologize to my sister, otherwise I am going to kill you." So Poe ends up going to one of his friends, Thomas English, and he tells Thomas about this whole scandal and how he needs a gun. And he tells Thomas, "Please get me a gun. I need a pistol on my person. I fear for my life." But Thomas English, for one reason or another, maybe because this is such an unbelievable scandal, says, No, I don't believe you. You're making this up." And Poe, being offended at having made up any of this, decides to get in a fight with Thomas. He just fist fights his friend, and both men walked away saying that they were the victors, so who knows how it actually went down. And eventually things did calm down. Elizabeth Ellet stopped asking for the letters. Nothing further happened other than just rumors, and people were just saying, "Oh, well, perhaps this, perhaps that." Oh my gosh, I almost forgot. And Osgood's husband, Francis Sergeant Osgood's husband, also wrote to Elizabeth Ellet and said, "You'd better stop because otherwise I'm going to sue you for insinuating that my wife would have an affair with Edgar Allan Poe." And that's what eventually stopped Ellet, is that she was like, "Okay, it must have been a fake letter." That's literally what she said. Is she said it must have been a forgery. So she's like, "It must have been fake. I'm sorry. Never mind." And she backed off. But that was the official end of the scandal, is that Poe fist fought his own friend over the drama in his life. Next, we have his feud with Rufus Griswold. Now, it's unclear exactly where Edgar Allan Poe and his former friend Rufus Griswold actually had a falling out. Now, I'm continuing to increase my knowledge on Edgar Allan Poe and do more research, but as far as I can tell, this is kind of what happened. Both Rufus and Poe are writers, and they are lovers of poetry, and they are actually respected people between the both of them. They enjoy each other's work. They have compliments. They have some positive, constructive criticism here and there. They don't always see eye to eye, but overall, they are very professional. But then we get this collection of poetry that Rufus Griswold decides to publish. And he asks Edgar, "Hey, would you mind giving me a positive review on this book of collected American poems? I'd really appreciate it. In fact, why don't I just give you $5? and he tries to slide it to him under the table, so to speak. He's like, "Why don't you just take this for yourself, for a positive review?" So essentially, he's just bribing Edgar Allan Poe for a positive review, because at that time, Edgar Allan Poe was starting to gain a lot of national attention. He was already a pretty prominent writer in his own respect and a very harsh critic. So people loved reading his critic columns because he was known as the Tomahawk Man, because he was going to chop your story to bits. That's how ruthless he was when it came to literary style and function. So, understanding that and how Poe's word carries weight, he bribes Poe for a positive review of this book. But then Poe reads this book and he understands, oh, wait, my poetry is only featured once or twice, and it's at the very back of the book. And he takes that as an insult. Now, when he had first read this, he had published some criticisms that he essentially was saying, it's not my thing, but it's still a good collection of worthwhile writers. However, he must have grown in bitterness, because then he went on a tour. And on this tour, he starts ripping apart Rufus Griswold and all of his work. And I think it's connected to while Poe is off on this tour, Rufus Griswold took Poe's job. It was which was the editor of Graham's magazine. So after learning that, Poe decides to say in an official statement that Rufus Griswold was wholly unfit either by intellect or character to occupy the editorial chair of Graham, the magazine. So obviously there was some bitterness there, and Rufus Griswold at that point, I think, just completely gave up on their relationship. The both of them developed that huge bitterness between them. And again, Poe's words carried weight. Rufus Griswold suffered a little bit from that criticism because Poe was starting to get respected. But then, well, this leads right into Edgar Allan Poe's death and his famous obituary. Now, Edgar Allan Poe's death itself is a mystery that's worth talking about, but I want to make a whole episode of this series on that. So just skimming the details, he went missing for a week before he was found, and then after he was found and tended to, he eventually died from some kind of inflammation of the brain, according to the diagnosis of the doctors of the time. Now, 2 days after he died, because Poe died on October 7th, 1849, 2 days after he died, there was an obituary published in the New York Daily Tribune, written by a man named Ludwig. This was a pseudonym for Rufus Griswold. So you can imagine your literary arch nemesis, whose book and work you have just completely dragged through the mud, and who has said you are completely unfit intellectually and by your character to have the position that you have. You can imagine how Rufus Griswold painted Poe in this obituary, and he does it so matter-of-factly. He just says that he essentially, Rufus Griswold, creates the image of Edgar Allan Poe that so many people think of today when they think of Edgar Allan Poe. Many people don't think that he was more than a drunken, mad genius when it comes to writing. That's essentially how Rufus Griswold painted him, that he was a manipulative alcoholic who constantly got into fights and constantly bickered and endangered the safety of others around him, but he was a literary genius. He uses phrases like Edgar Allan Poe Edgar Allan Poe is known by many but will be missed by few, or something along those lines. So the whole thing is just filled with a character assassination and this vitriol, these vile lies that actually painted Edgar Allan Poe as this dark, depressed, gothic, misunderstood, mad genius. And I think that the reason that stuck, not only because it's engaging and definitely much more interesting than saying, hey, this man who struggled with alcoholism and most likely had bipolar depression had a hard life, and that came through in his stories. Well, instead of that, I think the idea of a mad genius is more interesting to us, and it matches the style of his writing a lot more, because Edgar Allan Poe was a gothic horror fiction writer. That was his main thing. Now, he always considered himself a poet before being any other kind of short story writer, but Edgar Allan Poe wrote gothic horror fiction. And the Gothic, especially during the 19th century, was all about darkness and beauty and pain, which you see in his writing. And perhaps that was a part of him trying to come through the writing, trying to say, I am grasping at understanding and beauty and meaning in this suffering. But because this idea of this mad and seriously misunderstood, depressive, sulkin genius fits his gothic horror fiction better, that became the image of Edgar Allan Poe. not the whole human being who was capable of playing hop frog with his wife/cousin in a park. So today, I hope that we can, when someone does mention Edgar Allan Poe, give a little bit more perspective to him and his life, and also educate people on some of the things that he went through in his life and how his obituary completely misconstrues him and distorts his image. In fact, other people, when they had seen this obituary written by Rufus Griswold, many friends of Poe, many associates and co-workers of Poe actually completely denounced that obituary. In fact, here I'm going to actually look up a quote. This is from the book Edgar Allan Poe, A Life by Richard Copley. It is the most comprehensive biography of Edgar Allan Poe on the market. It's a wonderful resource. And the quote here is from George Lippard in the Quaker City of October 20th. It says, "And the men who now spit upon his grave by way of retaliation for some injury which they imagine they have received from Poe living, would do well to remember that it is only an idiot or a coward who strikes the cold forehead of a corpse." Ooh, that is such a great burn. I love it. It is worded so perfectly. And there were many other criticisms of this obituary that completely refuted Rufus Griswold's portrayal of him. But that obituary, because it fit his fiction style so much and because it was so much more interesting, culturally became what we adopted with the author. And now I have saved the worst for last, Edgar Allan Poe's racism. Now, this is debated in the scholarly world. It depends on what story you bring up. There is a very famous line that says, "We do not talk about the orangutan." That refers to the murders in the Rue Morgue. In the scholarly and literary and Poe biographer world, this topic is very controversial because so many people interpret his art in very different ways. Now, understanding Edgar Allan Poe's life, you see that he was in close proximity to Black people. So he played with Black children as he grew up. He was raised by a Black nanny when he was a part of the Allan household with John and Frances Allan. He had a Black barber. So he was not sheltered from the Black community. However, I think that's also a poor excuse to say that, like, oh, we don't want to use the excuse of, like, I have a Black friend, so whatever I think or say or do when it comes to the whole community is okay, right? That's just a scapegoat. So we are going to focus on his literature. Now, no one talks about this story, but I think that this is really important. I have not heard anyone mention this story in this debate. Hop Frog. Now, in Hop Frog, I won't spoil the whole story, but there is a character named Hop Frog who is a little person. And Hop Frog decides to get revenge on this king and his counselors and associates. And in order to do that, he tricks them. He says, "Let's play a practical joke on your court during a big ball. And what will happen is you will come out dressed as these monsters from across the sea, these orangutans. You will be in chains, and then I will tame you, and then you will take off the mask." Well, they weren't wearing masks. They were going to tar themselves and cover themselves in fur. And then you will reveal who you are, and everyone will have a nice big joke, a nice big laugh, because you've scared everybody. Now, the king and his counselors do that. They tar themselves, making them, themselves look very Black, and cover themselves in fur and hair, and bind themselves in chains. I hope you see where this imagery is kind of going. And then the twist is that Hop Frog collects all of the chains of the orangutans and hoists them onto a chandelier. And then the chandelier is hoisted up into the air, thus essentially holding all of the hanging all of the orangutans, and then he sets them all on fire. I don't know what I'm going to get censored for saying here on this podcast, but that to me is an explicit image of a LYN, no space in between, Ching. Because okay, I'm not going to even explain it again, but that is blatantly, to me, iconography that is a part of Southern racist culture. I have not seen anybody in the scholarly or literary world talk about that. And perhaps they've just gone over my head, but it amazes me that so many people talk about the murders in the Rue Morgue, and they debate whether or not the description of the, spoiler alert for this story, but the orangutan that is the murderer, whether or not it's a Frenchman or it's an Italian, and the way that they describe the body or the murder of the story is all up for such debate. That is a hot topic, like I said, and yet no one mentions Hop Frog, and I don't know why. So I think that is very strong evidence to suggest that Edgar Allan Poe is using racist imagery against Black people in a positive light, and that is very important for me to specify, because Hop Frog is the hero of that story, and the revenge, it's almost vindication by the end of the story, because the king has hurt somebody that Hop Frog is in love with. It hurts his love interest. And the whole thing is supposed to feel very badass, right? The whole gesture, the whole vanquishing in vengeance your foes. It's crazy. And it's very obviously supposed to be positive. And I think that is worthwhile evidence to show that Edgar Allan Poe most likely was racist to some degree. And considering that he was a Southern gentleman who lived in America during the 19th century and whose foster father, John Allan, also benefited from slave trade. And once that actually started getting more restrictions, he created more tension in the household. John Allan started developing a lot more resentment towards Edgar for relying on his money. And there were some other ventures that John Allan went into. He was also a tobacco salesman, but then that started going under. So there was a lot happening that affected John Allan's business, but he did definitely rely on the slave trade and slave labor. You also have other stories such as The Gold Bug with the character Jupiter. Jupiter is an exaggerated minstrel stereotype of a formerly enslaved Black man. And to clarify minstrel shows were typically shows kind of like vaudeville, but it was before vaudeville, exaggerated comedy shows, typically where white people would use makeup to put on blackface to depict racial stereotypes of African Americans. And for some reason, this was actually very popular in northern states in America. In fact, the song Jingle Bells, which originally was called The One-Horse Open Sleigh, was first performed in 1857, and that originated from a minstrel show. And that's just one example of something racist actually being appropriated for something much better. Because, of course, it doesn't have that connotation nowadays. That's just its origin, and we changed it. But the writer of it, James Pierpont, later joined the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. So not only did it originate in something very racist, but the author himself was also seemingly racist. And I'm not here to debate. It's our American history. I'm not here to debate that, dude. I'm not here for that conversation. Anyway, yeah, Jingle Bells, like you can even see how it culturally changed, like how this is the original recording actually by the Edison Male Quartet from 1898. This is the second recording ever of this song.
Hey, Mabel, where is that lunch basket?
Why, I think I'm sitting on it.
Oh, you think you're sitting on it, do you? Why, you know you're sitting on it.
Here, Maggie Murphy, you put that lunch basket under the stick, will you?
Now, Trevor, I want you to stop at the very first roadhouse you come to, understand?
All right, boys. Eat it.
a ring, making spirits bright. What fun it is to ride and sing a sleighing song tonight. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in one horse open sleigh. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in one horse open sleigh. Ooh.
So the reason I'm talking about Jingle Bells is because I'm trying to show that we can take something that might have been racist in its origin and appropriate it for something much more positive, which is what I think must have happened with Hop Frog, is that most people saw this as a badass tale of revenge rather than a depiction of something quite racist portrayed in a positive light. And of course, I can't end this segment without talking about the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is the only novel that Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote, is also quite racist. It depicts tribes of darker-skinned people being savages that are chasing the protagonist, and there's some symbology to where the character goes from darkness to light by the end of the story. That has also been used to say that it is more of a racist ideology, saying that the dark is evil, the white is light, is bright, is beauty. So, all of that to say that Edgar Allan Poe's suggested racism is one of the most hotly debated topics about him and one of the most widely controversial. That's why I added it here. But that is all of, well, maybe not all of, but most of the biggest controversies of Edgar Allan Poe's life. And I'm just starting to run out of time here. So I want to just wrap this up. So I hope that you realize from listening to this that Edgar Allan Poe was a full human being who was capable of being wrong, believing bad things, doing bad things, and he wrote some damn good literature. And again, I think we're all mature enough to balance those ideas at the same time and to say that we even glean from his works something that is bigger than him. From Hop Frog, I can see a beautiful tale of revenge while acknowledging this had a root in something that is racist. Like Jingle Bells. I just say, you know what? It came from this, but I can glean something different from it. And as long as we remain conscious of that, then we can actually determine what about it is positive, what about it is worth remembering. And it's important to also not erase history. It's important for me, as someone who admires his work, to not try and whitewash, so to speak, his history or try to justify his actions. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Unscripted on the Poe Show podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it. I enjoy the fact that I'm not using a script right now, and it allows me to just get all of my thoughts out there at once. So if you did like it, then please do like this episode and share it with somebody else who is a Edgar Allan Poe fan. So hopefully they can learn something about the man and share it with a student who's in school, who's learning about him, or someone in college, or share it with a scholar so that they can correct me on anything that I've gotten wrong, because I would love to be corrected and give correct information out there. And I would gladly make another episode correcting myself. So thank you again so much for watching. You're listening, excuse me. Thank you. This is why I write a script for these things. So I always know what I'm going to say next. But no, thank you so much for listening. Please do like this episode and share. That's all I've got for now. But you'll hear from me again on the next episode of The Poe Show.